Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so very much. First of all, I want to apologize for getting all of you out of class who have decided to make this your chapel experience today. This is terrific. They told me that we moved to the arena, that originally you would have been in the chapel, and I was afraid that it would be quite the opposite, that I would be the announced speaker and they would move from the normal chapel to a classroom with 12 chairs. So this is a delight, and I want to say thanks for showing up today. I know a lot of you are a little nervous about how long I might talk. After all, I've been a pastor, and then I got into politics, and that makes you nervous, and it should. I'll be through about 1:15, and then you can do whatever it is else you got to do. No, listen, I learned long ago that if Jesus had ever run for office, he would have added a beatitude to the New Testament. Blessed are the brief, for they shall be... And I will try to remember that. I will also tell you this, when I first ran for office, and I'd been a pastor for about 12 years, and a long process that I probably don't have time to go all into today, but really just sensed that it was time that some of us as believers become more than observers of the game, but get out of the stands and get on the field and get our jerseys dirty. Because I was concerned about the world in which I was living. And when I first ran for office, it just made some people not just uncomfortable, but furious. And especially the Baptists. They were the ones who were most upset because I was a Baptist. Am a Baptist. And I'll never forget, there was one lady who came up to me, she says, I just want you to know right now, sir, that I am not voting for you. I would never vote for you. And I too am a Baptist, but I want you to know that I don't think people like you ought to get in politics, and I wouldn't vote for you if you were St. Peter. And I said, lady, that's fine, because if I were St. Peter, you wouldn't be in my district. Oh. My other favorite moment was when a person came up and got right in my face and said, now, is it true that you're an ordained minister? And I said, yes, ma'am, that's true. She said, Baptist? I said, yes, ma'am. She says, let me ask you this question. Are you one of those narrow-minded Baptists who think only Baptists are going to heaven? I says, no, ma'am. Actually, I'm more narrow than that because I don't think all the Baptists are going to make it myself. And to this day, I'm pretty sure that's right. What a pleasure it is to be on this beautiful campus. I don't see how any of you ever get anything done. How could you ever study with these surroundings? I realize you don't. Okay. Now we know. But you have great tans. I want you to know. I'm really impressed. I am asked oftentimes, why on earth did you ever run for office? And it comes back to a simple conviction that I have as a Christian believer that I want to express to you today. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. I started taking that very, very seriously and realizing that when Jesus talked about salt and light, he spoke of it very differently than we tend to think of it in the 21st century, because sometimes we think of salt as that seasoning that we sprinkle just a little bit on our food to add a little flavor to it. But in the first century, salt was not so much a seasoning just to add a little taste to the food. It was the only preservative that was known. I mean, this was the time before refrigeration or even ice chest. Jesus was speaking to his disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. I want you to picture the scene. There are people out there fishing, bringing the fish in from their nets, and he's talking to the people who were there to listen to him. And when he said, you are the salt of the earth, it would have been pretty easy for him to have said that and swept his arm pointing over toward the fishermen who were bringing their catch up out of the sea, and he would have watched them as they were packing those fish in salt, because that's how they preserve the fish. And if the salt really wasn't salty, if it was like sand, it would be worthless. And here's his point. When something is decaying, when something is spoiling and rotting, it needs salt. And salt applied to that which is decadent preserves and delays the spoilage. Applied to us, it simply means that when Jesus tells us that we are the salt of the earth, what he's saying is that if we have this relationship with him, if we are somehow embodied with His presence, then He's expecting us to preserve that which is spoiling and decaying. And we can't hardly do that if we're not involved in that which is spoiling and decaying. And in fact, it means we've got to touch it. I guess the biggest concern I have is that a lot of Christians believe that when things get really bad, that's when we need to withdraw. We need to just sort of pull off to ourselves and hole up in the holiest of places. And I would suggest to you that that's when you need to be in the unholiest of places. That's when you need not to withdraw, but to engage. Engage with your whole heart and life. And if there's any great need in the world today, it's not that Christians would say, boy, I'm going to find a mountaintop and get as far away from all of these cultural challenges as I can. It's rather to say, I'm going to find out where all these cultural challenges are, and I'm going to get right in the middle of as many as I can, and I'm going to be salt, because that's what Jesus said I'm supposed to be. He said, you're the salt of the earth. He didn't say you should be, could be, would be. He said you are. You're it. If believers, people with a conscience and with a set of principles and values, based on something eternal, not something that changes with every opinion poll and with every election and with every style and every trend, but people who are truly committed to something that lasts, if they're not willing to be the salt, then there isn't any. I think most people would say, boy, our culture is in a state of decay. Would we agree? Now, we may have different versions of it. Your parents probably think it's all according to the music you listen to, that's the decadence. I don't necessarily agree with that. The funny thing is, the music that I listened to when I was a teenager, it's coming back around, and I'm so excited about that. I love that. My daughter is 26 now. When she was in college, she called me one time and said, Dad, I got a new CD. It's this band that I think you might even like them. I said, really? She said, yeah, they're really good. I want you to listen to it. I said, okay. What's the name of the band? She said, it doesn't matter because you wouldn't know who they are. I said, I might. She said, nah, Dad, because she thought I was pretty uncool. Still does. And she said, it doesn't matter who they are. I said, no, it does matter. I just want to know what's the name of the band. She said, Dad, you would know. Try me. Dad, it's a pretty hip band. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't know the name. I said, what's the name of the band? She said, like Led Zeppelin? I said, you mean Robert Plant, John Paul Jones, Jimmy Page, those guys? Her eyes got big. She says, Dad, how did you know that? I said, because, Sarah, I bought their album in 1967 when it was like an album, something you've never seen before. The fact is, I don't think the music or even the movies, art is simply a reflection of what we are. Sometimes people think it pushes us to what we are. I think it's a reflection. And the sad thing is sometimes what it reflects is pretty scary because it's reflecting a culture that has abandoned a sense of what's right and what's wrong. You know who I blame for that? I don't blame the artist. I don't even blame the secularist. I blame the salt, which has lost the saltiness. Because it never should be up to the sand to preserve anything. Jesus never said, I want all the secular people to preserve life, culture, and the things that are good and decent. Never said that. That was never the commission given to people who are outside of His grace. No, He challenged those of us inside that wonderful circle of grace that we are to be the salt. And my challenge to you today is that if you're going to be what God wants you to be, it's not so much about what vocation. We get so hung up on, what am I going to do? Am I going to be a nurse? Am I going to be a teacher, a doctor, a politician, a preacher, a missionary? Be what you are. Be salt. That's more important than the vocation. It's the passion that you take to your life. And I promise you that if you commit yourself to be salt, Jesus will make sure that you have plenty of fish to apply yourself to. Fish that are rotting, fish that are spoiling, because there's plenty out there. He will not allow you to stay in the salt sack very long. He will make sure that there's a place. The reason that so many people spend most of their lives trying to figure out what God's will is because they first want Him to show it to them, and then they'll take a look, evaluate it, and let God know whether they say yes or no to it. Say yes first, You may be very surprised where He takes you. Believe me, I am very surprised at where He's taken me. If someone had told me a number of years ago that I would have gone from this path from broadcasting, then to the pastorate, then to politics, now back to broadcasting. I was asking my show, we have a question and answer session on the show that I do on the Fox News Channel, and a person in the audience stood up and said, Governor Huckabee, you have been a pastor and a governor, and you've been a television host. What does this say about you? I said, it says I can't hold a job very long, is what it says. Now, you're the salt. I hope that sinks in, and you're the light. If things are dark and people are stumbling around in the darkness, they need light. And Jesus said, you're it. If you don't shine, nobody else is going to. If you don't help them see the way, they're going to keep stumbling. I think the greatest excitement that ought to be in your heart today, if you know Jesus Christ, is to say, I have a purpose. I don't know what everybody else is going to do in life, and I don't know exactly what kind of job I'm going to have and how much money I'm going to make, but I know one thing. I'm salt. I'm light. I got something to do. There's people stumbling out there in the darkness, and I matter. There's stuff spoiling out there, and it matters that I show up. Because this world has never been perhaps so in need of real salt and real light. By the way, the darker things get, the more impressive your light is. And I know there are many times people say, you don't understand, I'm not really terrific, I'm not overly talented or gifted. Forget all that stuff. In a dark room, a little bit of light makes a difference. I remember as a student at Southwestern Seminary, I had one pair of shoes to my name and they had holes in them. My wife and I were so broke we were living off cans of soup. I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I just want you to understand that the thought that I would ever stand here in front of you, that I would be able to do the things that I've done is really beyond me. I know where I come from. I grew up in a little town in South Arkansas that nobody had ever heard of until Bill Clinton decided to run for president. Because he's from there too, Hope, Arkansas. It's a little town that nobody ever thought about. I grew up the son of a firefighter who worked a second job on his days off from the fire department, and with 2 jobs, he barely could pay the rent on the little rent house that we lived in on 2nd Street. I grew up in a family where I had a mother who went through the Depression like many of the children of my generation whose parents went through the Depression, and therefore we feel like we did too, because we had to hear all the stories all the time. My brother grew up the oldest of 7 kids, lived in a house with dirt floors, no electricity, outdoor plumbing. Not plumbing, outdoor toilets. There was no plumbing. And I know where I come from. Nobody in my family, as a male, upstream from me, not one had ever even graduated high school, much less gone on to college. I'm standing here today by the grace of God. And I know where I've come from, and I can tell you this. In a world where things are dark, even a little bit of light can make a difference. In a world where things are spoiling, a little bit of salt can help preserve and delay the spoilage. And that's why more than ever before in your life, I hope that as a student at PBA, rather than say, oh, I wonder if there is a future for me, you will say, there is a future for me. I just want to make sure that I'm as salty and as well lit as I can be, so God will be able to find a use for me on this incredible planet that He made for His own purposes and glory, and I just don't want to miss out that He's got something for me to do. Worry less about your career, less about your income and what it may be, and more about making sure that whatever it is, that you say, I will be salt and light, because that's why God has left me on this planet. We can change the world with that. And frankly, we really need to. Our world is decadent. I see the fact that we have gone into a state of great disrespect for human life. I was here in this state in Florida when I was asked the question in one of the CNN debates by Wolf Blitzer, what did I think was the most important issue that we face in America? And I know what the answer was supposed to be. It was supposed to be, I was supposed to say the Iraq War, I was supposed to say the economy, or one of the answers that we're kind of programmed to say if you're a candidate for president. And frankly, I think I surprised him a little bit, because when he asked me the question, I said, I think one of the most important issues that we have to determine as a culture not a political issue per se. It's whether or not we're going to respect the dignity, worth, and intrinsic value of every human being as regards the sanctity of human life. And I think he was very surprised by that. And I think some of the other candidates were. But let me explain why I believe that this is important. How we treat each other, how we view each other as fellow human beings is the ultimate test of what kind of civilization we leave for the next generation. When people say, "Are you anti-abortion?" I say, no, that's really not the issue. I am pro-life. And let me explain the difference. I believe that there is worth and value in every human life, whether it's a life in the womb of the mother or whether it's the life of the 8-year-old in the backseat of some car living because the parents are homeless. I think that child has value when he's 14. I think that child has value when he's 19. And I think that person has value when they're 80 and can barely shuffle one foot in front of the other. You see, I believe what the founders said about life. They gave us some pretty incredible words in the Declaration of Independence, words that they staked their lives on. 56 incredible, brave men who signed this document. And I want you to know that they signed it knowing full well if this experiment in government didn't work out so well, they were all going to die for it. That's pretty bold. These weren't guys that thought that the consequences of signing the document was going to be higher taxes or maybe not getting appointed to some board. These people knew that if they signed their name to this document, taking on the very British government, the most well-equipped, well-financed, and well-trained army in the world, and they didn't win, they were dead, and so were their families. And by the way, this nutty notion that the reason John Hancock signed his name so big in big letters was because he was an ego-driven maniac, it's not true. You know why he signed his name that big? Because he said, well, if the British are going to come get us, and if the king's going to send somebody to take our lives, he can start with me. So I'm going to put my name up here where he can find out, by golly, who signed this thing, because I'm not ashamed of it. That's pretty bodacious. And I thank God that there were people who loved our freedom so much that they were willing to risk their lives. Here's what they said in that Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's bold in itself. That these are truths. You know, that's politically incorrect to say something is truth today. But then they said these truths are self-evident. That means that they're so obvious that we shouldn't even have to declare them, but we're going to anyway. And here's what they went on to enumerate. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Inalienable meaning nobody can take them from us because nobody gave them to us. Our Creator gave them to us. He built them into us. They are as much a part of us as our blood and our bones. They are who we are because He has created us with this unique sense of independence, this unique and amazing sense of autonomy as a human being, so autonomous that I can personally know God and not have to ask your permission to do it, and that He can know me and talk to me, and He doesn't have to go through anybody or any institution on earth in order to do it. We're created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I want you to understand that when these men signed this, they didn't fully live it out. I'll grant you this. It took many, many years before African Americans were considered to be equal. Quite a few years before women were considered to be equal. They got the concept right. They didn't get the application quite right. But the principle is powerful. And it's bigger than sometimes the politicization of the issue that we've made it to be. And here's why I want to express this to you. To say that we are all equal because God has made us that way means that nobody is better than another person because of external and temporal things. It means that, unlike it was in the day in which they were subjects of the British Kingdom, how much land you owned did not make you worth more than another person. Your last name was not your ticket to greatness. And it wasn't your occupation. And it wasn't your ancestry. You see, their idea was that your value and your worth is tied to the fact that the Creator of the universe has made you. And that's where you get your value. And it has nothing to do with your net worth. It has nothing to do with your personal address and how big your house is or how big your car is. It has nothing to do with your parents' last name and all of the ancestry that they could point to. And boy, listen, growing up, I was glad of that. Because my dad always told me, son, don't look too far up our family tree. There's stuff up there you don't need to see. I started looking one time and I realized he's right. There is stuff up there I didn't want to see. Your net worth doesn't make you somebody. Your IQ. You are as important to God as anybody else that sits around you. You may have grown up in the most humble home represented at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and yet to God you're just as valuable as the person who grew up in the nicest home you've ever been in. Their last name doesn't mean more than yours. And that idea of intrinsic worth is where I came to the conclusion that all life is precious and valuable and should be protected. From the beginning at which that life is conceived until God has decided, and only God has decided, that it should end. And the reason that I think that's an important issue is because once we've made the cultural decision that we have devalued some lives over others, I want you to understand that the logical conclusion of that decision has implications that we can't live with, none of us. Let me give you an example. If my generation tells the generation after me that we can terminate a life because that life represents an economic inconvenience or a social disruption to the biological mother, and that for those reasons we can end that life, then we have said that the grounds of ending a human life for economic or social reasons is acceptable, because we've decided that those conditions mean that that life is not worth as much as one that does not represent social or economic inconveniences or interruptions. Now, what happens when that generation to whom we have given this cultural mandate and norm gets to be my caretaker, and I get really old, and my children now are responsible for taking care of me, and the day comes in which I become an economic interruption to their lifestyle and a social disruption? You know what I've done? I have given them a license to take me out. Look, my kids are looking for that, I know right now, and I'm not going to give it to them, by golly. The reason I'm pro-life is because I want to make sure that they recognize that even when I'm old, my value, my worth, is not determined by my capacities physically. It's not determined by my mental acuity. It's determined because God has decided that I'm worth something, because I was made by Him and for Him, and nobody has a right to devalue what God has placed the price tag on. Nobody has a right to put a price tag on you either. Nobody. And what that means in a practical way is that if God has put a valuable price on you, why sell yourself for less than what you're worth? Why would you give your life to someone who doesn't respect and love you as much as God does? The reason to preserve oneself, even sexually, for a person who values you enough that they would commit their life to you in marriage is because you're worth more than for somebody to use you as a toy, a plaything, a throwaway, and a disposable. You're worth more than that. For heaven's sakes, live your price. The reason that you can't afford to throw your life away in some career where the only goal is making money, and you become obsessed with the net worth that you have and how many boy toys you've come up with, is because your life is worth more than that. You're more valuable than simply the sum total of possessions. Your life counts for more than that. Don't allow anyone to take from you that value that God has placed on you. You know, the price that sometimes your friends and other people may put on you, even for some of you, the price, the value that your own parents put on you, may be far less than the one that God's put on you, because you are incredibly valuable to Him. And I got to tell you something. Looking at where I've come from, and I think about that the God of heaven, the Creator of the universe, would even know who I am. That staggers my imagination. It's amazing to me. I'm still amazed that people know who I am. And television has an amazing quality of people knowing who you are. I wish I'd been as well known running for president as I am hosting a show on the Fox News channel. It's really sad, you know? I mean, I spend the whole presidential campaign in virtual obscurity where nobody knows or cares. I get on Fox News, and now every time I'm out in the streets and go to the airport, hey, watch your show every weekend, which I'm glad to hear. But it's stunning. Now, sometimes people think they know me, but they can't remember why. They're not sure if I ran for president or sold them a used car last year. They just say, I think I recognize this guy from something. Right after the campaign, before I got on Fox News, I was on an airplane coming out of Atlanta. True story. I was in the aisle seat. The guy next to me in the middle seat kept looking out of the corner of his eye like, I know this guy, but I can't figure out why I know him. And people were coming down the aisle, and every one of them were saying, Governor, good to see you. Good to have you on our flight. I voted for you. I used to hear that a lot after I left the race, and I realized at first it was very flattering. Then I came to the conclusion that if all the people who claimed to have voted for me actually had, I would have been president by then. And this guy was trying to put it together. He knew that everyone was calling me governor, so either I was or had been a governor, and then they all had voted for me, except him. Of course, he knew he didn't know who I was. And he was trying to figure out who I am, and finally, I could just see his face light up, and he nudged me. He said, hey, I know who you are. You're Mitt Romney. God is my witness, that's what he said. I want you to know that whether people know you or not, God knows you. And that's what's amazing to me. As stunning as it is that people would recognize me, it's more stunning every day when I realize that the Creator God of the entire universe not only knows me, but He cares about me. And you. And you. There's not one person in this place today that He is not intimately involved with, that He does not care about, and for whom He does not have a very specific purpose for your being here. And if you want to know what's the purpose of college, is to find out why He created you. Your purpose is not to just get a degree. It's to get a purpose and a mission. And then to spend the rest of your life as the salt and light living it out. And by the way, that means getting out there where things are spoiling and where things are dark. Now, I don't get into a whole lot of possessions. There are two categories of possessions that I'm somewhat fond of. One, I have a fairly decent and growing collection of guitars. I don't have as many as I want, but I have a lot more than I need. People ask me sometimes, how many do you have? I said, I'm not telling you because my wife doesn't know, and we don't need to let her find out. And the other possession that I have that I really enjoy, I don't get to spend as much time on it, is a bass boat. 20-foot Bass Cat bass boat, 225 horsepower outboard Mercury on it. And I really love bass fishing. And the boat's pretty cool. Now, if you were to ask me, well, Mike, tell me about your boat. How fast does it run? Here maybe would be my answer that would surprise you. I'd say, well, you know, honestly, I don't put it in the water because, man, you know, you get in the water, there's junk down in there. You could hit something, knock the lower unit off, and bend up the prop and bump a stump and then get it all scratched up. Don't want to scratch up a beautiful, nice, new boat like that. So I don't put it in the water. I keep it in a really, really nice warehouse. It's not just any warehouse, though. A bunch of us boat owners keep our boats at the warehouse, and we park them in this great big warehouse, and we love our boats. And every weekend, when we get off work, we all show up down at the warehouse, and we go in and we polish up our boats, and we talk boats to each other. We read boat books, and we do studies on boating and boating safety and better boating. We love boats so much, we even take up money, and we take the money and we give it to people who actually go out on the water in boats, and they get in the water, and then they come back from time to time and show film strips and slides and videos about what it's like to be on the water. And we just say, isn't it great that there are people who will go out there in the water in real boats like this? And we polish our boats a little more. We sit up in our boats and we wave at each other. And if you have a boat, I would really suggest you join our warehouse, because we have one of the most warm and hospitable atmospheres, and we even take trips to go watch people build and float boats. It's just a great group. We sing boat songs. I mean, we do it all. And if you thought that was true, you'd say, that guy's a nut. Spent all that money on a boat. He doesn't even put it in the water. Well, I got to tell you something. A boat was never intended for the warehouse. The boat is intended for the water. And if you don't put your boat in the water, there's no point in being a boat. And by the way, I got to tell you something about being a boat. You're probably going to get scratched up. You're probably going to get some holes knocked in the hull. You may bend the prop from time to time. And people will look at you and say, golly, he's all beat up. But it's better to be a beat-up boat than one who has never known the joy of skipping across the water and being what you're supposed to be. I think you know what I mean by all this. If you think that being a Christian is sitting in church, going to the warehouse, being a wonderful, polished-up boat in the warehouse, you got it wrong. The Lord's not looking for boats in the warehouse. He's looking for some boats in the water. And boats in the water make waves. Boats in the water stir things up. Boats in the water sometimes knock into things. Trust me, I was in politics for a long time, governor 10.5 years. I got some scars to prove it, people. After you've been hard-tuned, lampooned, and cartooned by the editorialist of all the newspapers of your state, you know, it's painful. And I'm not going to tell you that if you go out there and put your boat in the water that you're never going to have your prop bent or have a hole knocked in the hull. Chances are you will. But at the end of life, I'd rather be one who knows what it means to have been in the water than one who's only been in the warehouse. You've got to decide, are you going to be a water or a warehouse kind of Christian? And finally, let me just tell you that the world's waiting for you to change it. I hear about change. Why don't you be the change? And don't just change the political structure. Change the moral structure. Change the ethical behavior, starting with yourself. Because if we don't, horrible things can happen. I've been to Israel 10 times. I love going there. And every time I've ever been, the most recent time last August, every time I always go to Yad Vashem, which is a memorial dedicated to the victims of the Holocaust. It still stuns me that in the most advanced, educated, and sophisticated people on earth at the time, within Germany, where education was heralded and the greatest scientists lived, and some of the most well-learned, even theologians, lived, that there could be something like the rise of the Third Reich to power and the attempted annihilation of the Jewish people. It's a horrible chapter of human history. Unforgivable chapter of human history. One I can't even comprehend fully, and not that long ago. And Yad Vashem is really an exhibit. I won't call it a museum. There's nothing pleasant about it. But it's an exhibit dedicated to the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. And in 1994, when my wife and I went, we took our 3 children. My daughter, who's now 26, at the time was 11, not quite 12, a few months from her 12th birthday. And as we got ready to go to Yad Vashem and take some people who were with us, we talked about whether or not we should take Sarah through, because, quite frankly, it's a very emotional experience, and I've never been there without weeping and having it deeply touch me. And I wanted her to see this, and I wanted her to understand why we have to become involved in our world, because what can happen when we don't? What can happen when good people assume, this isn't happening to me, I'll look the other way and I'll live my life, I'm going to isolate myself from all of these things because it's not my problem. And I wanted her to see that, yes, it is your problem. And here's what happens when we act like we have our own personal world and it doesn't affect us. But I also didn't want to traumatize her from some of the things that I knew she would see. Janet and I discussed it and finally decided, yes, she should go. I wanted her to see and understand why her parents would do something as crazy as leave what was for us a pretty comfortable life to get into the shark-infested waters of politics. And so I said, I'll take her and I'll walk her through, and if things get really out of control emotionally for her, I'll just take her out. I took my daughter by the hand and we started going through Yad Vashem. The first part of it depicts what happens to the Jewish children in Nazi Germany when they were forced to wear the yellow stars of David on their clothing in prominent places. So they would be isolated and then humiliated by their classmates, laughed at, teased, ostracized. My daughter just couldn't believe that people would do that to a child younger than her. We got to the part of Yad Vashem that depicted the Warsaw Ghetto where children were literally shot as sport by the Nazi soldiers. And the reason we know that is because in their absolute, utter decadence, the Nazis photographed themselves doing it and left behind the evidence because they were proud of what they should have been ashamed of. And those photographs give us a vivid picture of them literally killing those children. Those who survived often found their way on the streets, and the only warmth they would get on a cold winter's night would be laying across the grate of a sewer. The food that they would eat would be something tossed from an upper story window by some sympathetic Polish family who knew that if they were caught feeding these kids, they'd probably be on the next death train. We came to the part of Yad Vashem that depicted Auschwitz and Dachau, the Nazi death camps. And when the crematoriums could no longer incinerate the massive numbers of Jewish people who were being brought there for extermination, large open graves were dug with bulldozers, and bodies of thousands of Jewish people were simply shoved off into those mass graves. The pictures are still haunting in my mind, and they are embedded in me like a burned-in image. So many bodies stacked on top of each other that they don't even resemble human bodies, but look like sticks of lumber on wagons as they're pulled to those mass graves. My daughter had gripped my hand ever so tightly. She stared at those photos and she looked at them. And I could see in her face that trouble, that how could anybody do this? She didn't say anything. When we came to the exit of Yad Vashem, there was a guest book as we were to leave. And my daughter reached into my pocket and took the pen that was in my pocket, and I watched over her shoulder as she started writing her name and our address there in the guest book. And then right under that, there was a place for comments. I was curious to see what would my daughter say. What would be her comment? What was her reaction to this? Did she get it? Did it get through to her soul? Did she get it? And if there was ever a doubt in my mind as to whether or not she got it, those doubts were erased when I saw my daughter write words I'll never forget so long as I live. In that space, she wrote these words, simple. In her childish, 11-year-old scrawl, this was what she wrote. Why didn't somebody do something? That's all she wrote down. That's all she had to write. Why didn't somebody do something? And with that, she put the pen back in my pocket. And for 3 more hours, she didn't say another word. But I never had to ask her, does she understand why we can't sit on the sidelines and watch what happens to other people? Never had to ask her that again. Not to this day. And I prayed that day, dear God, please don't ever let there come a time when some father would take his daughter through a memorial dedicated to the United States of America, what once was a great country, and watch his little girl write words that would ask the question, why didn't somebody do something? And I pray that's never said of you. Instead, today, I pray that you decide right here and right now that you'll be the somebody. You'll do something. God doesn't ask you to be everybody, just somebody. He doesn't ask you to do everything. He asks you to do something. He said you're salt. He called you the light. You're it. He needs you. You've got to be available. Put your boat in the water. Be the somebody. Do the something. God bless you. You want to just stay up here and play with you guys? Okay. All right.
We're usually just the praise band, but for today, since we have Brandon McGuire on the guitar, Jamie Walsh on the drums, and Nick Andrews on guitar, but we have the governor with us, so we're the Huckabee today. So we're gonna play just a song with him. So should be kind of fun.